classic tale of the awakening of conscience is a very old one. It is one of the oldest that humanity has, and it is told in the book of Genesis that Paul read an excerpt from that chapter today. After placing two people in the Garden of Eden, God points out to them that they should never eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But after God leaves, Eve discovers a sly serpent coiled around the roots of that tree. She is drawn into conversation with it, and this is an imaginative retelling of that conversation from A. Powell Davies. "I should probably not eat that fruit," Eve said. "God told me that I shouldn't." "Don't be silly," the serpent hisses. "God is treating you as though you were a child. You are a grown woman. He wants to keep you unaware all of your life. Grow up. Eat this fruit. It will give you knowledge, the same kind of knowledge that God has, the knowledge of good and evil. And besides that, it tastes good. Try some. Give some to that doltish man of yours. What's he so timid about anyway? Or are you too afraid? Oh, poor Eve, poor simple, silly Eve. Why, she's just a frightened little baby." "Who's a baby?" Eve demanded. "Who's afraid? Give me some of that fruit." And so she takes it and she eats it. Adam then eats some too once he figures out that he can blame someone else for doing it. We won't get into all the complicated gender dynamics here, but let's just say that this story is chock full of them. After eating the fruit, it would seem that the effect was immediate. As soon as God reappears in the garden, Adam and Eve both want to hide. Their newfound inner awareness, this new awakening that they experience in themselves, makes them afraid. The knowledge of good and evil had arrived with a vengeance. Conscience had come to earth. Here's what's interesting to me about the story, at least from my reading of it this time around. It would seem that conscience is not something that neatly abides with authority, including religious authority. God did not want people to taste the fruit and to find their conscience. But instead, by developing their own inner awareness, conscience puts a wedge between humanity, between Adam and Eve, and any outside force that would define right or wrong for them. In other words, Adam and Eve learned good and evil for themselves, and they no longer needed anyone, including God, to tell them about it. They had to rely on their own inner experience, and because of that, they were exiled from the garden. And just like that, humanity suddenly grew up and had to start making decisions about right and wrong for themselves. What is your conscience? Or perhaps a better question is, where is your conscience? I like the double entendre of that question. On the one hand, it seems to be asking about the actual location of conscience in the individual's mind and body. I'm reminded here of René Descartes, who famously said that he had discovered where the soul resides, in the body. He believed that it was located in the pineal gland, which looks like a pea-sized oval inside the brain. It is a strangely specific physical place to declare the residence of a non-physical entity, such as the soul. But it makes me wonder what Descartes would say about conscience. Does it live in the pineal gland too, or perhaps somewhere else? On the other hand, the question, where is your conscience, is sort of a wake-up call. If someone asks you where your conscience is, she probably means less where is it in your body, and more something along the lines of pay attention. Haven't you seen how important this issue is? Issues like the Syrian refugee crisis, the battle of transgender rights and the use of restrooms, the issues raised by Black Lives Matter about police profiling, all of these are calling people to find their conscience, to become involved, to make a choice, and to make a difference. Here, conscience exists in relation to particular issues. It is activated by our confrontation with injustice. Now, conscience is a word that emerged from the Latin conscientia. It's the same root that the word consciousness shares. The ancients thought that we become aware of right and wrong at the same time that we simply become aware. In other words, it is a deep and abiding feature of human life that we have this inner awareness of right and wrong. In a way, the story of Adam and Eve is the story of how we became human, where our budding human consciousness is tied with our becoming conscious of right and wrong. That's what makes us human. Now, many have speculated that such inner awareness of right and wrong is what makes us human. I'm in the middle of reading David Mitchell's fantastic book, Cloud Atlas. And I have been utterly sucked into this breathtaking novel that spans genres and lives and centuries. It is the story of one soul who is reincarnated 6 times, and the reader gets to watch the same themes emerge in each of the lives depicted in the novel. And one of these themes is the development of conscience and the ways that moral actions inspired by conscience have effects that span the ages. Cloud Atlas views acts of good and evil as having effects far beyond what we can see or predict. One of these lives takes place in the distant future, a sort of dystopian future where human beings have created clones that will serve them and do menial sorts of labor. These clones are not supposed to be sentient. They fundamentally lack self-awareness. However, every once in a while, a clone starts to develop consciousness. One of these clones, Somni 451, is a waitress in a diner and begins to think and feel, and that part of the novel is a detailed description of what happens to her inner life as it begins to develop and become complex. Sanmi 451's consciousness starts to bud, and her human owner decides to try to expose her to writings and knowledge. He becomes curious to see if she can become human and how human she might become. But she soon loses interest in those things, in things like books and reading. Tellingly, she says that knowledge without experience is like food without sustenance. Intellectual learning is not enough to fuel human consciousness, she says. And so she is given experiences beyond just reading. And through this, she starts to learn about the injustices of the world, the unfairness and the brutality of what happens to clones like her. And she starts to have feelings and judgments about those things. And eventually, she comes to act bravely against the oppression that she witnesses. And it is this awakening of conscience that makes her fully human. And that is enough to finally give her humanity sustenance and awakening. Unitarian Universalism would also affirm that conscience is what gives our humanity sustenance. Some religious traditions may ask you to memorize a code or a set of rules, a list of right and wrong that has an external motivation for following it. That's not so with Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism builds into its principles the use of conscience calling upon members to cultivate their inner awareness that helps them define right and wrong. Specifically, our fifth principle affirms the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. I take this to mean that Unitarian Universalism is committed to asking the question that frames this sermon: where is your conscience? Our faith tradition says it is your job to find that inner awareness that calls you to action and then to act on it. Now, conscience is a wedge, and it can be uncomfortable. Just as it separated Adam and Eve from God, it too can separate us from the cultural traditions that we grew up with, or the values that our families espoused, or the morals preached by some clergy, or the nationalistic rhetoric spouted by some politicians. And here's the harder part. It can even separate us from each other, from the people who are sitting right next to us in this beloved church community. It can be deeply unsettling sometimes to realize that someone who's sitting right next to us believes something very different about whatever particular issue that we believe firmly in. Now, our congregation recently wrapped up its stewardship campaign, and part of that campaign was collecting feedback from members about the congregation. And some of the comments that emerged were that, especially during this recent season, since November, our church has not done a particularly good job accepting political diversity. Now, I think there are a couple of issues here, and I want to see if I can tease them apart. The first thing to be said is that liberal religion is not liberal politics. Liberal religion is not liberal politics. There are many people who identify both with liberal religion and conservative politics. They may believe, for instance, that free market solutions are the best option for health care, or that poverty will not be fixed in the long run by government programs, or that the death penalty is acceptable in some cases. When Unitarian Universalism reaches the point that it can no longer hold different political beliefs such as these within its membership, then I think it has unnecessarily shrunk itself. Moreover, our affirmation of the right of conscience stands as an invitation for people to think and feel through these issues for themselves and to arrive at their own conclusions and convictions. It can stand as a check against groupthink. But that is not the end of the story, as far as I see it. That's because Unitarian Universalism, through the slow development of its tradition over 5 centuries, has arrived at certain issues of conscience that it is undeniably committed to. And while it can remain open to political conversation and difference of opinions, while it can hold space for dissent and disagreement, the Unitarian Universalist tradition has reached a consensus on certain core values. And it needs to speak up about those, and it needs to do so strongly. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that our lives begin to end on the day that we become silent about things that matter. When Unitarian Universalism does that, it too starts to die. For me, it's all about the first principle. It's about the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I feel called to affirm that from a place of conviction and conscience like never before. All I have to do is open up the newspaper to see how crucial this is right now. 7 transgender women of color have been killed since December. Anti-Semitic hate crimes have doubled in certain places. Nationally, hate crimes are up 20%. The children of immigrants are being taunted by their classmates and sometimes their teachers with threats that they will be sent away. Muslim women have had their hijabs ripped off, and this month a Sikh man was shot by someone yelling, "Go back to your country." in the midst of all of that, we need Unitarian Universalists to articulate a strong voice of conscience, one that stands for the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We need to do that bravely because there are people who are being actively targeted and harmed and that need our voice and our support. In response to this need, the Unitarian Universalist Association has issued a declaration of conscience, one that I have signed and that our church's Board of Trustees has also signed, saying that it will guide our work as we go forward as a board and as I go forward in my ministry. Now, it is posted today in the back of the sanctuary, and after the service comes to an end, as you feel called by your conscience, you are invited to sign it as well. Part of it says this: at this extraordinary time in our nation's history, we are called to affirm our profound commitment to the fundamental principles of justice, equity, and compassion, to truth and core values of American society. In the face of looming threats to immigrants, Muslims, people of color, and the LGBTQ community, and the rise of hate speech, harassment, and hate crimes, we affirm our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Those are indeed things that I wholeheartedly affirm from a place of conscience. It is what my inner awareness of right and wrong cannot deny. In Cloud Atlas, Sonmi 451 is condemned to death for her act of conscience and heroism. But as her story ends in the novel, another begins, and it is the tale of a new group of people centuries later who study the life and acts of Sonmi 451. Her acts of conscience inspire people far beyond what she ever imagined was possible. It's fiction, but perhaps it can be true too. Perhaps our acts will have ripple effects that span our lives, our relationships, our society, maybe even span out through the ages. We don't necessarily know what will happen to the good that we put out into the world. But it may move far beyond our simple acts, and it just might make us human in the process. My spiritual companions, amen. I love you, and blessings on this journey that we share together.